welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to do is we're going to unbox Power Automate Desktop, Microsoft's latest addition to its robotic process automation capabilities. Let's go. Now on this channel we've talked about this a little bit before. In May 2020, Microsoft acquired Softomotive, who makes an RPA tool called Win Automation. Now as a result of this acquisition, a lot of that IP, that intellectual property and technology, is now available for Microsoft to include in its Power Automate offering. And that's essentially what we're seeing here with Power Automate Desktop. That's the new name. It includes a lot of that intellectual property and technology that Softomotive brought to the acquisition through Win Automation. But in addition to it, it's now been integrated into Microsoft's Power Automate service. And so that's really what the focus of this episode is to give you a brief tour of this new integrated experience. Now, I do want to call out that this is in public preview, and so there might be a few edges that we need to be aware of, but all in all, it's pretty cool, and it gives you a sense of where Microsoft is going and how RPA will converge with our existing capabilities that are found in Power Automate, known as API flows. Before we dive deeper into the content, I wanted to let you know about an emerging community found at serverlessnotes.com. This is a community resource that covers best practices, tips, and latest announcements built on contributions by technology enthusiasts from around the globe. On serverlessnotes.com, you'll find content related to Power Automate, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Service Bus, Azure Functions, and much, much more. Serverlessnotes.com is brought to you by Serverless 360, a portal that is focused on operations and support for Microsoft Azure serverless resources. Now, this is a complementary tool to the Azure portal, and it helps organizations in supporting Azure serverless applications. You can find out more about Serverless 360 at serverless360.com. I want to spend a few minutes just on the install before we get into a demo and the actual product tour itself. Now, if you have logged into Power Automate this week, you might have seen this specific notification just offering you to give more information about the new tool and a launching pad for you to get more information, which is cool. And as part of that installation, there are some prerequisites and some components that are important to understand their role, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about here. So number one is you do need an on-premises data gateway. So this is the enterprise version. This is not the personal version that you might use for Power BI, but you might already have this in your environment if you need to talk to on-premises file shares or SQL servers, things of that nature. But the version does make a difference, so do go ahead, make sure you have the latest version, and I've got the link here, I'll include it in the description. Go ahead, get that latest version, just so you don't run into any sort of incompatibility issues that might exist. Now, when you go into UI flows section of Power Automate, right, so you can go ahead and create a new API flow, you can go ahead and create a new UI flow, and if you try to create a new Power Automate Desktop UI flow for the first time, you're going to get an experience that looks like this. And as a result, you do need to get the app. Now, this is an app that is installed locally on the machine that you want to run your UI automations. So there's an agent component here, but there's also the Power Automate Desktop, or what we're calling PAD, design experience as well. That's all bundled in that one package. So you'd go ahead and you would click this download, get at the app button, and then you will have a short install experience to walk through. That's essentially what we're going to see on this screen itself, right? So you need to include these components here. So we've got the UI flows. This is more of the legacy experience. Now, legacy being, April of this year, but this was the initial, I guess is the better term, the initial UI flow experience. And then we've got the Power Automate Desktop preview, and that's what we're really interested in today. Now, the next screen, we're going to be able to choose our install path. In general, just leave it as is. And, I would generally just leave all of these checkbox selected. One thing that's super important with all of these RPA tools is that there is a browser extension. We're going to talk about that on the next screen, but do ensure that you do have these checkboxes clicked on because we're going to need them later on. Next, go ahead, click the install button. And then here's where you want to be able to ensure you are enabling these extensions. So here we can see UI flows, once again, the initial offering from Microsoft, Power Automate Desktop, the most recent offering. And what you need to do is click on each of these links, and then what it'll do is it'll open up your web browser and go to the Manage Extensions experience, and you really need to make sure that you've got these turned on. Now, once again, there's going to be two here. We've got the initial one for UI flows, and then we've got Microsoft Power Automate Desktop Preview. So you want to definitely make sure that this one's on, because without it, you're not going to be able to record, which is going to be a downer. So what I have here is I've got the experiences for both Chrome and for Edge Chromium. And once again, make sure that they are turned on. Obviously, you can choose if you just want to use Edge Chromium or if you want to just use Chrome itself, your choice. But those are the two best browsers to run this experience in. Now, once that's installed, you're going to see a desktop application, right? So this is what it looks like. If you saw my previous videos about Win Automation, it had a different experience. It was orange and black, and then obviously like the typical Windows Forms color. Here, this looks like a very modern experience and aligns very well to Power Automate itself. So you'll want to sign in with your same account that you would with Power Automate, like the service. So if you were going to go to flow.microsoft.com, log in with the same credentials as you do have here. Now, another thing that's important, there is licensing implications with Power Automate Desktop and RPA in general. So what you will need is either like a paid license, or you can sign up for a trial license. But you need to ensure that you do that before you get to the screen. Otherwise, you're going to get an error indicating that a license isn't found. Now, how do you go ahead and sign up for a trial? Well, the simplest way is when you go to the pricing page for Power Automate, there will be a try free link. You can click on that, enroll in a free trial, no obligation, and be able to go ahead and try this stuff out for 30 days. Now, once you've signed in, this is the experience you're going to see. So obviously, I've been messing around with Power Automate Desktop already, so I have some of these UI flows that are already here. For you, for the first time, you're just going to see a blank screen, which is totally fine. The other thing that's super important here is we've got the environment picker. And so if you've used Power Automate before and flow.microsoft.com, you always need to make sure you're in the correct environment, because you could have multiple, like dev, test, prod. Same thing applies here. So always make sure that you are lined up with your environment, because what happens is when you go ahead and save, in this case RPA in a day, it's going to get saved to that environment, which is awesome because we don't have to manage these scripts separately. It's all part of the bundle, which means it's solution aware, which means we can package it and move it from one environment to another. So this is really about that better together story, and really why Microsoft has a platform approach to addressing all of these common needs like security, governance, and ALM, for example. Now, once everything's installed, you've gone ahead, you've installed everything, everything's configured, and you now want to go ahead and create that new UI flow, you're going to get prompted with this option, right? So we've got Pad, the preview, and then we've got the initial offerings, right? Where you would use the Windows Recorder or the Selenium IDE. Really going forward, my personal advice is really you would need a reason not to use Pad, Power Automate Desktop. So this should be your starting point. This is where you're going to see the most comprehensive RPA offering from Microsoft. And so if you want to go ahead and build out a Power Automate Desktop UI flow, and once you've gone ahead and saved it, you'll be able to surface it or call it using this action here, right? Which is part of the UI Flows connector, run a flow built by Power Automate Desktop Preview. And that's how you essentially invoke these UI flows that are created. So enough of the slideware. Let's go ahead and let's go deep into this box, and let's go ahead and explore the product and see it live. Okay, so I'm in Power Automate Desktop. These are the UI flows that have already been created in this environment. Let's go ahead and open up Product Tour. And so this is the UI flow that I'm just going to show you some of the capabilities that exist inside of Power Automate Desktop. There's obviously a lot, so we're only going to scrape the surface here. First up, left-hand side, we've got actions. These are kind of similar to connectors inside of Power Automate, but this allows you to go ahead and essentially use prepackaged functions that do exist. And so we've got things like variables. If we want to go ahead and to create a variable, clear a list, assign a list, do things like of that nature. We've got our conditions, we've got loops, we've got flow control, we've got wait statements. We can go ahead and manipulate files. We've got our Excel, which we're going to see in a little bit here. There's a lot of Excel functions that are highly useful. And we can also leverage, command line sessions. We've got cryptography. We can go ahead and call web services. So this is a rich set of components that we can really use inside of our Power Automate desktop experience itself. Then what we've got is our core canvas here, where we can drag and drop these different actions onto our canvas and configure them much like we would do in an API flow. Here we've got our ribbon, where we can go ahead and do things like perform local debugging, and that's where we can use run and run in next action. We can also launch the web recorder or the desktop recorder as well. On the far right side here, this is where we can configure our inputs and outputs. When we go ahead and do so, what happens is from our API flow, we will now surface these variables or these inputs as dynamic content actions. And we're going to see that later when we run the demo, that num1 and num2 will be provided or exposed as inputs. And then in this case, answer is our output. On top of that, we do have variables that we just can use as part of our overall process itself. Now, just to give you a quick sense of what we're doing here is we're going to go ahead and record an application being run. In this case, it's just going to be a calculator. I know, I apologize. But in this case, everyone has access to the calculator, so that's why I chose it. We're going to have two inputs, num1, num2. We're going to be able to get an answer. We're going to display that answer in the screen itself. And then what we're also going to do is I'm just going to show you a little trick here as well, where you can also go ahead and use elements like send keys, where if I want to go ahead and just copy a value, I can go ahead and copy a value from a screen as well. And I can also put that into clipboard and then get that and store it in a variable itself. Then what we're also going to do is we're going to close down the calculator and run a subflow. So a subflow is kind of like a child flow. And in this case, I've got it called call Excel. And as part of the call Excel, we're going to go ahead and open up a spreadsheet. We're going to find the first free row in that spreadsheet, and then we're going to write our values, num1, num2, and our answer into 3 different columns. We'll save the Excel file, and then we will exit the subflow and head back to main. So that's an important thing. If you have some of these larger RPA processes, you do want to make them modular, and you can go ahead and do that by using subflows itself. Now, just to give you a little bit of sense of the experience, let's go ahead. Let's just add our calculator here, which is replicated by run application. That'll happen automatically. But now what we can do is, just to show you the desktop recorder experience, is I can go ahead and click on that button. Here's our recorder. And what happens is when we click the start recording, anything that we do is now going to be replicated. And we can see that by this red border showing up. So what we can do is we can click here, we can put in a number of say 8, we can then go ahead and click the times button, we can click back up here, we can say 9, and then we can go ahead and click on the equal sign. Now as part of that, we want to retrieve this value, so we then would right mouse click and we can say get text display is 72. And we can go ahead and do that and then click finish. And so that will generate a script for us. And it did that here at the top of our script itself. Now, so we've got all of these steps that we just recorded. Now, one thing I will call out, as I mentioned before, this is public preview. And so as a result of that, there are sort of some things we do need to be aware of. This is something that will be fixed here shortly. But what it's going to be assuming is that the display is always 72, like that value is always 72, which is not the case. So what we can do is head over to UI elements and really go ahead and update this selector. And what we're going to do is just go ahead and update it and just remove this dependency, because right now it's assuming that it's always going to be 72, and that's not the case. We're just going to go ahead and say we just want to make sure the ID is calculator results. And so we can go ahead and deselect this. Now also note that this display is something that is just embedded in the calculator itself. So that's not something that I've added. And so that's going to be part of our workaround here. Naturally, we could go ahead and use string manipulation to remove that, but that's also where we're going to use the send keys as an alternative to using that as well. So let's go ahead. Let's just delete these steps, but I did want to just show that in case you wanted to try that out for yourself. Go ahead and give that a shot. Now, in this case, let's close out of here. When we do have these inputs, these essentially have default values. So we've got a 3 and we've got a 5, and we can go ahead and edit those, right? Change those values. But this is very helpful for local debugging. And then what will happen is once we use an API flow, we will pass these values in and they'll get overridden. But just to show you the local experience, I can go ahead and click on run. And now we can see that we are executing, right, step by step. And in this case, I do have a message box, so this was deliberate. And so here we can see that display is, right? So this is ordinarily where we'd want to get rid of it. And so we could just do a string replacement, or in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and send keys. I'm going to send a Control A on this specific UI element, and then I'm going to do a Control C, just as an alternative, right? So that's what's happening here. And now we can see that we're just getting the value 15. Naturally with RPA, there's always like this preferred path, and then there's always these fallback plans. And it's always good to have strategies to do fallback, and that's really why I wanted to show you this. I typically would not want to do Control A, Control C, but once again, it was just an option. It's just good to be aware of these types of things. We're going to click OK. Our calculator is going to close, and now we're going to start up Excel. So that's what's going to happen here shortly. And so what's happened is we've just gone ahead and added this new row of 3, 5, and 15. So we can close this down, and essentially our script is complete and it was successful. So that's great to see. So let's go ahead, let's flip over to API flows and show now how we would go about calling this Power Automate Desktop UI flow. Okay, so I am now in an API flow. I've just got manually trigger a flow. I've got my 2 inputs, num1, num2. If I was going to try to find this specific pad UI flow that I just created, I can go ahead and type in UI flow here. I would then go ahead and say I want to run a flow built by Power Automate Desktop. Now what's super important, especially when you run this for the first time, is you need to create a connection. And this is a connection that's going to use that on-premises data gateway that we talked about. So when you click on add a connection, you need to select your gateway, right? The gateway that's been configured. And then you need to provide credentials, username, password, and credentials in order to log into that machine. So that's something you do need to set up. And with one set up, you can go ahead and select the specific UI flow that you want to call. Now you notice when I selected product 2, it has 2 inputs. And as a result, we now need to provide those. There's also attended and unattended mode. For unattended, you do need a specific license. And for today's purpose, we're going to use attended, which will allow us to see the RPA running locally on the same machine that we're recording. If it was unattended, it would have to be on a different machine that we're not logged into. So let's just go ahead, let's delete this. And here we can see that we've populated num1 and num2 from our trigger, right? And then what we can do is the send mobile notification allows us to use the output. And that's what we have right here. So let's go ahead, let's test this out. And in this case, we will use different numbers than what we showed in the demo, just to show that this is dynamic. So we'll have 7 and we will have 4. And let's go ahead and let's click run. So here we have the calculator, right? We've got displays 28. We'll just click through this. Obviously, you wouldn't have these message boxes in the middle of your RPA process, but it was more just to show you folks what's going on behind the scenes. So we're now done with calculator. We can see that we've got Excel. And sure enough, we had row 6 is what we previously, when we debugged locally, and then we've got our latest execution, which is 7, 4, and 28, which is awesome. And so now what'll happen here is we will be able to complete the overall Power Automate Desktop experience, and then we now have been able to complete the API flow experience as well, and we can see that we have our answer of 28. All right, so that was a lot to go through in 11 minutes or so, but I wanted to give you folks just a sense of like how you can use this tool. Obviously, I'm going to be going very deep on Power Automate Desktop in this channel, but hopefully this gives you just an early look into what you can do with it, and there's much more to come from that perspective. All right, so thanks for checking out this video. If you're not following me on Twitter, I'd encourage you to do so at Weare. On top of that, if you are on YouTube, I always appreciate likes. Go ahead and hit that like button. If you're not subscribed, do subscribe. There will be much more to come, especially around Power Automate Desktop. Thanks and take care.